I call the honourable member for Corangamite.
Thank you very much, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker. I rise to join my parliamentary colleagues in supporting this motion concerning the recent extremely disturbing developments in Iraq. Just this morning we awoke to more devastating news. ISIL fanatics have reportedly murdered American journalist Steven Sotloff in the most brutal and horrific manner. His murder is a shocking and barbaric act. This is obviously heartbreaking news for Mr Sotloff's family and friends. This is heartbreaking for the United States and for all nations who join together to condemn these most despicable acts of inhumanity. Mr Sotloff's murder comes just weeks after the murder of another American journalist, James Foley, also at the hands of ISIL. As a former television reporter myself, this really hits home. These men were doing their job and nothing more. It's only through the courage of journalists like Steven Sotloff and James Foley that we can begin to comprehend the vile events that are unfolding as ISIL's march of hatred continues in Iraq and Syria. ISIL is reprehensibly using violence to intimidate journalists. The Committee to Protect Journalists reports that at least 70 journalists have been killed covering the conflict in Syria and Iraq. The CPJ estimates that approximately 20 journalists are currently still missing in Syria. Many of those missing journalists are believed to be held captive by ISIL. And of course, it's not just journalists who are being murdered by ISIL fighters. The Prime Minister has dubbed, and rightly so, ISIL a death cult for very good reason. Its reign of terror and hatred has seen thousands of innocent people indiscriminately murdered simply because they do not subscribe to the same beliefs. In June alone, we understand 1,922 people were killed in Iraq. A further 2,600 or so people were wounded. Amnesty International has warned of ethnic cleansing on an historic scale. What is at risk in northern Iraq is a potential genocide. We have seen beheadings, crucifixions, mass executions and kidnappings. Children and women have been abducted and reportedly raped and killed. Hundreds of women have been kidnapped and forced into sexual slavery, subjected to the most horrific degradation. Iraqi Human Rights Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sanani says people have been buried alive. The situation can only be described as a nightmare. And the threat is not only to people living in the Middle East. People from countries like Australia are travelling to the Middle East to take part in this violence. As our government understands, about 60 Australians are on the ground fighting in Syria, in Iraq, and about 100 more are providing funding or facilitation. The murderer of James Foley and also Steven Sotloff is reportedly a British man. The reality is that the rise of ISIL presents a real threat of terrorist attacks here in Australia. There is a concern that Australians fighting with ISIL will become further radicalised and learn the terrorist trade. If these people come back to Australia, it poses a serious threat to national security. I welcome moves by our government, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, to keep Australia even safer and more secure. The government is investing $630 million to counter violent extremism and radicalisation. This includes $24 million to the Australian Crime Commission to support its efforts against terrorism. New counter-terrorism units are being established at all our international airports, and an additional 80 Border Force officers are being recruited. I also welcome the humanitarian mission to transport aid and military equipment as part of a multinational effort aimed at helping those at risk of ISIL forces to protect themselves. I also welcome news that Australia will accept a formal invitation to become an enhanced partner with NATO, reflecting our shared goals in working towards a peaceful international order. I particularly commend the way in which the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, and the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Julie Bishop, have handled this situation to date, as well as the government's moves to keep people safe abroad and at home. The situation in the Middle East is indeed a highly dangerous one. Doing anything involves serious risks and weighty consequences. But doing nothing, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, involves risks and consequences too. The Chief of the Defence Force has confirmed this morning that an Australian aircraft has joined an airlift of supplies, including military equipment, to the Kurdish regional government in Erbil. American, British, French, Canadian and Italian aircraft are also involved. Australia is doing what we can to help. Our involvement has been at the request of the Obama administration and with the support of the Iraqi government. Australia remains in close contact with the United States and other international partners, and we will continue to work to alleviate the humanitarian situation in Iraq and address the security threat posed by ISIL. There has been no formal request for combat forces and no decision taken to get further involved in the conflict. There will be no combat troops on the ground. What's happening currently is a humanitarian intervention with, of course, the full support of the Iraqi government. Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, we welcome the comments by UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon that without addressing this issue, we will just end up allowing these terrorist activities to continue. Australia cannot and will not leave the Iraqi people to face alone the evil unleashed by ISIL. It is right that we do everything we prudently can to prevent its spread. It is right that we do everything to protect the innocent men, women and children of Iraq and Syria in the name of freedom and democracy and justice and humanity. Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker.